Periodization and integration. In 1998, I provided a very simple working definition of periodization. I described it as planning of training. 7 years later and 11 years later, we have periodization means planning with one word placed in between it. In 2000, I wrote a commonly used synonym in the physical preparation world for planning is periodization. A commonly used synonym in the physical preparation world for planning is periodization. What do we have at the bottom? The technical term in the training world for having a plan is periodization. So we see a quick review here. I said it once, over the next 12 years, 11 years, it was repeated multiple times. And my 2000 sentence, a common used synonym in the physical preparation world for planning is periodization. So just a little bit of an addition of a word here or there and a bit of a change, a bit of a substitution, an insertion, an insertion. Duration of programs. I talked about 4 to 12 weeks. Full recovery should be inserted at the end of that. Every 12 weeks, a full week off from training should be scheduled. So full recovery weeks should be inserted at the end of each of these training programs of 12 weeks. And 7 years later, we have a repeat of that sentence with some minor modifications. Injury risk if recovery is ignored. In 1999, I spoke about ignoring this concept is guaranteed to overtraining. 6 years later, we build in recovery and progression volume without the risk of overtraining. Periodization models. In 1998, I provided a working definition of alternating periodization. And I spoke about the advantage that it has over linear periodization. 7 years later, we have verbatim. Use involves alternating between volume and intensity. And another term used is accumulation, I had in brackets, and then again another term used intensification, I had in brackets, and it was just edited down, still in brackets, but just the keywords with a /. So alternating periodization has been well used. Now this is what, 98, 11 years later, word perfect, again, 11 years later. Periodization, advantages of alternating. In 98 I wrote the advantages include that it avoids the detraining issues involved in the linear progression. That is, reduces the concern of detraining, metabolic or neural adaptations because of more frequent exposure to each. 7 years later, advantages. Cut out a few words, avoids the detraining issues involved in linear progression. Instead of IE, more frequent exposure, and a little to neural and metabolic, which was back up there. 11 years later, 2009, same use. Disadvantages. Requires the trainee to be experienced in load selection as the reps drop suddenly and significantly. Requires experience in load selection as the reps change quickly and significantly. Just 1 or 2 changes. And in 2009, 11 years later, still getting a workout. Now the example I used in my periodization models in 1998 included 4 3-week blocks. So 3 weeks per block, alternating here, 12, 8s, 10s, sixes. What do we have here? 7 years later, 4 3-week blocks, 12, 8, 10 sixes. 11 years later, the same thing. So it's simply the graph turned into text. Linear periodization. In 98, I wrote about linear periodization providing a working definition, involves a linear progression in lowering reps and increasing load, brackets representing the inverse relationship between volume and intensity. 7 years later, involves linear progression in lowering reps and increasing load, brackets representing the inverse relationship between volume and intensity. Word perfect. It got to work out again 11 years later, and on more than one occasion. This is a seminar, this is a, we call it a book I guess, but whatever it is, it's my writing, claim copyright by another author, however you do it. Talking about linear periodization, the advantages of, I made a working definition again. It allows the trainee to develop load selection as a progression of reduced reps. 7 years later, allows the trainee to increase loading regularly and develop load selection as a progression of reduced reps. 11 years later, allows the trainee to increase loading regularly as a progression of reduced reps. And that shouldn't be bold. Disadvantages of linear periodization. I provided a working definition here that in the early stages may cause a detraining in neural adaptation and the later stages may cause a detraining in metabolic adaptation. 7 years later, disadvantages may cause a detraining effect in neural adaptation in the early stages and a detraining effect in metabolic adaptation in the later stages. Word perfect, some words moved around, but that's all. Just some subtle word manipulation. 11 years later, used again. Now the linear periodization model I presented in 1998 using an illustration was again 4 3-week blocks going 12, 10, 8, 6, and 7 years later 4 3-week blocks using 12, 10, 8, 6. So just the text turned into text. The illustration was turned into text. Now the periodization models in 1998 I talked about. This is a periodization of strength qualities, and I introduced control stability, general strength, etc., etc. At those stages, nobody was doing that. Hypertrophy, strength and power was about the extent of it. And this is a 2000 graphic illustration. And then we have 7 years later, stability, strength, power, etc., etc. 99, I said the three main generalised types of periodisation I'll talk about in the book. And 6 years later, 3 primary models of periodisation. And again, 10 years later. So in an overview, paragraph by paragraph, arranged vertically, we see linear periodisation, the model of reps and weeks, the benefits or advantages. Actually, the word advantages, wow, that's a whole one-word addition. The disadvantages, alternating periodization, defined, and the rep model, and the advantages, and the disadvantages, and then another model of periodization, which was not included by myself. So you could say, great, original work. The challenge is simply use the same cut and paste from above and applied it to another periodization model. So work I did in 98 got further, it worked here in 2009, 11 years later.